So good to see everybody here. Thank you so much for joining us. This is just wonderful. It's so exciting for me to be able to see movies on the big screen again, you know, enough Netflix to last me a lifetime over the last 2 years. And, you know, having, you know, just in case you don't know, I'm Fred Fuchs, and I'm the chair of the Westdale Cinema Group. And my background, I think this is a little loud, I'm hearing a bunch of echo, was as a movie producer. I worked in Los Angeles and Hollywood for many years. And it was always a dream when I retired that I would be involved in a community theater like this, and we'd have these kinds of screenings and conversations and talks about movies. And it's so exciting to see that there's an audience in Hamilton that really seems to be enjoying this and appreciating this, and it's just wonderful. We were doing this on, thank you. Now, of course, we were doing this online, and it was great, but you had to watch the movies on your TV set. And watching movies on the big screen is how I grew up, and perhaps many of you. And I think there's something that happens when you watch a movie like this with an audience that is a completely different experience than watching at home. So I encourage you to keep coming to the Westdale. We have a lot of great movies to show, and both new movies, old movies, etc. And this series, if you've not attended before, is a series called Movies That Mattered. We always try to have a theme for our different screenings. And this was important to me because, you know, as a film professional, I often hear about, oh, movies are, you know, and they're so horrible because, you know, the way they portray women or, you know, sex and violence and all the negative things that movies have done to influence our culture. But of course, in the same way, there's so many positive things that movies have done to influence our culture. And they are such a powerful medium, even still today. And I think it's great to take time to recognize the movies that mattered, that, you know, really did affect society and influence people, and hopefully brought about social change, which of course is just, you know, exactly what many of the artists who work in the film industry really hope and why they became involved in the first place. You know, and of course, when this movie came out in 1947, movies were all there really was in terms of media. Well, there was radio, but, you know, this is long before internet and TV. And the influence that movies had back then was even greater than the influence it has now. In 1947, for example, even here in 1935, when this movie theater was opened, I think you know maybe perhaps a little bit of the history of the Westdale, but when they planned the Westdale Village, which is a planned community, the first planned community in all of Canada, by the way, it was planned based on some social experiments in Germany. They put a movie theater right in the middle of Westdale Village, and very intentionally, because 60% of Canadians went to the movie once a week. This was the form of entertainment. This is what people did. And of course, therefore, when they saw films, it even had more of an impact. More people saw films than they even see today. So anyhow, this is sort of the context, because 1947, you know, quite a long time ago, but I just wanted to remind you again of the power of what happened with the movies then, even more so now. Now, this film, of course, is about anti-Semitism, which was a very, very serious problem, even in 1947. You know, it wasn't until after the World War II, going into the early 50s, that any changes really began to happen in America, and I assume Canada. By the way, I'm American. I grew up in New York. I grew up on Long Island. I'm from a Jewish family, and in fact, my sister's a rabbi, and we never experienced anti-Semitism because we never met anyone who wasn't Jewish. So I grew up in a town called Roslyn, where my high school was 97% Jewish. And the reason, of course, is we weren't allowed to buy houses in any other of these, you know, Tony, you know, Long Island neighborhoods, in the 1950s. You just couldn't do it. So the Jews from, moving out from the city had to create their own towns. And therefore, that's where all the Jewish people would come. So I never even met anyone who wasn't Jewish until I went to university. So, again, it's just so interesting how this impact of anti-Semitism and the evolution of the Jewish experience in America and Canada as well has taken place over all these years. And again, 1947, when this movie came out, was a very critical time. Now, one thing, of course, that you also should remember is the entire film industry, the American film industry, was created by Jews, right? They were all immigrants from Europe. The heads of all of the studios, the Warner Brothers, who actually lived in Canada for a while, Sam Goldwyn, Carl Lammel, Adolf Zucker, Louis B. Mayer, Harry Cohn, they were all Jews and they were all immigrants. And the reason they wound up creating this film industry was they couldn't get into any other business, right? They couldn't go to school, they couldn't go to, become doctors or lawyers, they couldn't get involved in the banking industry or the insurance industry. They had to create their own industry. So here we have these immigrant Jews coming to Los Angeles. First they were in distribution, but ultimately in production. And this is, in 1910, early teens, and creating this incredible industry, which not only became hugely popular in America, but it became a huge international industry. In fact, when you think about it, the movies of that period, and even today, were the greatest cultural export of America and sort of defined for the rest of the world what America looked like, what people in America felt and thought and talked about. And of course, it was all being created by these immigrant Jews. So this is a much longer conversation and, how this all came about and how this happened. But it is the context a little bit of even how this film managed to be made. Because at the time, the Jews who were running Hollywood didn't want to talk about Jewish culture. They didn't want to be identified as different or separate. And so there were almost no movies made that had Jewish characters as main characters. There weren't very many Jewish actors. They all, of course, had to change their names, including the one who's in this movie, John Garfield. And so when this, after, again, World War II, the conversation about anti-Semitism began, it actually made everybody quite nervous. So Gentleman's Agreement actually began as a series published in a magazine. It was published in Cosmopolitan back in 1945. And at the time, Cosmopolitan was not a literary critical, it was a popular magazine the way it is today. And these stories, this story, which was serialized, where there'd be a different part of the story, was not a great, critical novel, but it did tell basically the same story as the one you're about to see tonight. But, and it became quite a phenomenon because no one had really discussed this in the public from a magazine. And then, of course, they did publish the book, and the book was very popular as well, but again, not, it was, how many people were reading and, reading this magazine. It didn't have the reach and power of a movie. So what happened was, though, that there was the head of Fox, a guy named Darryl Zanuck, and he was, incredible, one of these great moguls. He was a screenwriter for Warner Brothers. And what happened to him, he had applied to the famous Los Angeles Country Club for membership, and he was denied. He wasn't even Jewish, but they assumed because he worked in Hollywood that he had to be Jewish, and they denied his entry. And he was so upset about this that he decided he would fund the making of this movie, and went out of his way to hire the best screenwriters and directors and actors, because he really, really felt very deeply because he had personally, indirectly felt the effects of anti-Semitism. Now, the other moguls who were running the studios all went to him and said, "Don't do it. We don't want this movie coming out." They didn't want anti-Semitism to be a subject of conversation. They were very afraid, and again, this was something that was very prominent in general in the Jewish community in the 30s. We just, let's leave things alone. We don't want to get attention. We want to fit in. We don't want people to hear about the problems or there was a lot of insecurity about being Jewish in America. And so therefore they were very worried about it. But he said, nope, I'm doing it. And eventually, of course it did happen. But I think it's very ironic that the movie was actually financed and made by a non-Jewish person, while the Jewish people actually didn't want the movie made at all. But again, this was a time when things were starting to change. Because remember, all the veterans are coming back from World War II. And when they were asked what they thought about, what changes would you like to see made in America after your experiences, the responses were generally, above everything else, the need for wiping out racial and religious discrimination. Because they had experiences in the war, fighting alongside of Jews or Catholics or Black men, and really started to understand, humanity, that we're all one. And so when they came back home and they saw all this discrimination still existing, it really felt wrong. And that certainly was, part of the context of what was going on in the late 40s, right? But again, anti-Semitism was as strong as ever. There's this sort of a myth that, somehow after World War II, anti-Semitism went away. That's not really true. It really wasn't until the 50s, even into the early 60s, that you really started to see changes made in terms of both, legislation. One of the first things that Jewish groups were able to affect change with had to do with employment. There used to be all sorts of employment restrictions, that had to be, change. The laws had to be changed, and employers could not, not hire Jews, and other, racial minorities. And that all really didn't even start to happen. In fact, when asked the question, most people, the question, do you think Jews have too much power in the United States? In 1938, 41% people said yes. In 1945, 58% of people said yes. And it's a complicated question because, of course, World War II, there was also this, of course, Germans, and there were a lot of German Jews who people just thought they were Germans. And, there was a lot of confusion about all of this. But it was clearly, a very challenging time, but kind of an exciting time because, of course, this was an opportunity at a time when a lot of these, Jewish soldiers and the next generation were starting to become affluent and starting to make money and starting to go into business and were, and more willing to kind of assert themselves as Jews. The other thing, of course, that had happened was, the rise of Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel. And that had a very profound effect because it also brought more pride to the Jewish people, and they started to realize they should be able to be proactive about their situation and speak to the government and they did create many different organizations to lobby the government and to start to see this kind of change. Because remember, at that time, Jewish people couldn't get into medical school, they couldn't go to law school, academia in general was not really available to, you had to sometimes go to Europe if you wanted to get a medical degree. That wasn't something that was easily done, and it took quite a bit of time to change. So a lot of it did really have to do with the fact that the Jews were willing to fight more actively than they were ever able to do before. So, of course, this wasn't just true in the US, it was true right here in Hamilton. And I assume some of you must know that where we're standing right now in Westdale Village, no Jews were allowed to buy homes. This was a Protestant enclave. It was, in fact, it was the first planned community in all of Canada. You know how the Main Street and the Oval and all the streets go into the middle? Well, this was all very highly planned, and Westdale Properties, and this was planned by Protestants, and I'm saying Protestants because they were reacting to the immigration of the Italians and the immigration of the Irish who had kind of were taking over Hamilton. They wanted this Protestant enclave in the suburbs, because of course this was the suburbs back then, and they actually had a covenant in every deed of every house that read, none of these lands shall be used or occupied or let or sold to Negroes, Asiatics, Bulgarians, Austrians, Russians, Serbs, Romanians, Turks, Armenians, whether British subjects or not, or foreign-born Italians, Greeks, or Jews. That was literally in every deed to every property in Westdale Village. And it was legal. It was completely legal to do that. So it wasn't until after the war, right around now, 1947, 1948, that was the first time that someone broke the covenant. A Jewish man, I think he was, the irony that as I understand the story, if anyone knows the story, fill me in, but he was a quarterback for the Hamilton Ticats. And Livingston might have been his name, I'm not sure, but he was the first one who was, fought it and bought a house in Westdale Village. But this, of course, continued into the 50s. And then, of course, finally, when it did get broken, this ultimately became a very vibrant Jewish community because they weren't wanted in East Hamilton or up on Aberdeen or many other places were completely closed to the Jews. So they all came flooding down to Westdale once that was and the synagogues were built, etc. And of course, this kind of anti-Semitism continued through the 50s, even the early 60s. In fact, of course, Jews in Hamilton weren't able to join any of the golf courses. They had to start their own golf course. Beverly, the Beverly Golf Course, right, was created by some, Jewish guys in the early 60s, primarily because they could not play golf anywhere else. So, it sounds like a long time ago, the 60s, but not so long ago, right? So anyhow, that's sort of the context of what's going on here. The film itself, of course, was an enormous success. It won Academy Awards. It won an Academy Award for Best Picture. And in fact, let's see, it was nominated for 8 Oscars, and it won 3. It won Best Picture, it won Best Director, Elia Kazan was the director, and it won Best Actress, Celeste Holm, Best Supporting Actress for Celeste Holm. And it also was a huge financial success, which no one expected at all. So it was a very well done movie. Now, you may look at it, 1947, it probably will seem a little dated to you. Some of the language will seem dated. Some of the attitudes and kind of the naivete that people show in the film may seem again dated to you. We can talk about some of that stuff after the screening. After the screening, we'll do a Q&A and love to hear from everybody about what you had to say. But I'll just tell you a couple of other small things about the film. The main role, because again, Zanuck wanted this to be an important movie, was first offered to Cary Grant to star in it. So you can try to imagine Cary Grant in the leading role, but he turned it down. And then Gregory Peck, who was emerging as a star, did decide to accept the role, although his agent told him, don't do it, you'll never work in the town again. And, he was endangering his career. And they put together a fantastic cast. Dorothy Malone, who was a big star at the time, Dorothy McGuire, she was nominated as Best Actress, Celeste Holm. Moss Hart wrote the screenplay. He was a legendary playwright, in Broadway, had won many Tonys. So they really brought in wonderful, wonderful people to play almost all of the parts. And in fact, you can look for Dean Stockwell. I don't know if you guys remember that actor, but he was a kid actor at the time, and he plays the son. And then, of course, John Garfield, who was really, his real name was Jacob Garfinkel. John Gilbert, who was sort of a star at that time, was Jewish, and he volunteered to be in the movie in a small supporting role, even though he was, a leading man himself, because he wanted to support the film. He realized how important this could be for the Jewish community. And I think that's, and he gives a wonderful performance. Now, the director, of course, is Elia Kazan, who, if you don't know, was one of the most important directors in American cinema. He was Greek and originally worked in theater and was an actor, and he was quite well known for making movies that that had social impact. In fact, he said, "I don't move unless I have some empathy with the basic theme." So although, of course, he wasn't Jewish, he certainly was familiar with the challenges minorities and immigrants had in America. And then, of course, he went on to make such movies as Pinky, which was an incredible film in 1949, which addressed racial prejudices and racism. Streetcar Named Desire is another one of his films. And then with Marlon Brando, he did On the Waterfront, which was an incredible film about union corruption in New York City. And in fact, we will be showing On the Waterfront as one of the films of this series. So that's, I think, sometime in November. But if you're interested and you don't know Elia Kazan's work, you should, because he's really kind of extraordinary. I think that's about probably enough to get things started. So anyhow, I hope, by the way, how many people have seen this film? Oh my goodness. See, that's kind of sad to me, because this is one of, and have you seen it on the big screen? No. So again, this is why this is exciting. I think you're going to see something, again, Best Picture, 8 Academy Awards, hugely successful, 1947, about a subject that nobody wanted to talk about. Nobody wanted this film to be made. But the influence of this film was very, very considerable at the time, and we'll talk a little bit about more and how that happened after the movie. So I hope you can stay and look forward to seeing you all then. Take care. And again, this was Darryl Zanuck, not, cheaping out. He went for the best, for the writer, the director, all the actors, and everything else. Yes, please.
More so a comment. There was a neat little parallel that I noticed where, the scene where the guys are like, so what if he's Jewish, when the lady sort of, I don't remember, Kathy, is that her name? She sort of like
Dorothy McGuire?
Yeah. She sort of approaches his son and says, "Oh, you're not
Jewish. You're really
blah,
Christian.
blah, blah."
It's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There was a moment where the late Senator John McCain was asked at one of his conventions by a woman. She was very scared. She's like, "Is it true that Obama's a Muslim?" And he responded with, like, if he was, would that matter?
Right.
Which I think is brilliant. And it shows, that there's decency in politics sometimes, or there was decency in politics.
That's a great comment. And again, I think what was so powerful about this story was it wasn't a typical anti-Semitism story. In fact, there was some criticism of the film, even from the Jewish population. And the criticism was, well, this is just talking about high society and fancy people. And, this really wasn't showing the real brutality of anti-Semitism, at the time, and how people, really, poor people and middle-class people really, really suffered from it. And so this is just like one tiny slice of, of the reality of anti-Semitism in America. And in fact, if you really think about it, for a sophisticated journalist, for Gregory Peck's character to be so naive and surprised that, this hotel was restricted, or, how people reacted, a little naive as well. So that was one of the criticisms of the film. But, in the long run, I think it didn't, really, it did what it was intended to do, and it was really not trying to tell an entire story of what was happening in society, but was really focusing on the probably the most insidious part, which Kathy and John Garfield have that wonderful talk at the end in the dinner. It's not the people who are out there, telling jokes about Jews or restrict. It's the quiet minority who just sit and let it go by, and why and how that's such a powerful problem. So to me, I thought that was amazingly interesting. And I also thought that maybe part of the reason this film was such a universal success is it really isn't just about anti-Semitism, right? It's really about prejudice, and it could apply to Irish people or Italian people or certainly black people. It really was, in a way, was really a very universal story. And I think maybe that was part of it, because obviously, the Jewish population in America was tiny, when this film came out, and it certainly wasn't just Jewish people coming to the movie and were so impacted by it. Any other questions, comments? Can we go back down again?
I find the story fascinating. The complexity of it is fascinating. Even the subtlety of the last part of the article had not been written yet, because the movie had not
been finished
yet. And brilliant in all respects. I'm going to ask about the impact of the movie, because having gone to Westdale High School by lying about where I live.
Is that right? Okay.
Because
you wanted to go, and you had
from the North End, and with the phrase "put a wop on top." This is when Eugene Levy was there, and Martin Short, and Jeff Bloom.
Yeah.
With that, and it didn't occur to me that when I saw Jeff's wife Heather, that they even knew Jeff's wife, Len's wife, Len Bloom. Yeah. Heather. Because they hired me to play harmonica at her leaving U of T. She said, we voted for you, and Jeff and I are your fans. The whole complexity of brings me to the question of, if it can have this kind of impact on me 75 years later, aside from the fact that it got nominated for Oscars, etc., what did it change?
Well, like I said, you never know what a single movie, how it affected change in itself, but it was part of a period of time in the late 40s, and as I mentioned before, there were a number of factors going on, and some of it really had to do with Jewish people becoming more confident about their own Jewishness and willing to stand up and fight for it. And that's when, and then the second part, and we can't minimize the impact of this, was the creation of the State of Israel. It's hard to imagine people who didn't have a country for 2,000 years, right? So who were they? They were just gypsies, the Jews. They lived in Europe. They got kicked out of Europe. They lived in Spain. They were kicked out of Spain. They come to America, the land of the free, and, had to create their own businesses, had to create their own country clubs. This is, America was supposedly this democratic, country with no religious restrictions. So all of this was going on. And of course, the Holocaust as well had a huge impact. The recognition that 6 million Jews had been killed, that anti-Semitism was, it's greater now than it was even during the Inquisition or any other time in history. And I think so the timing, it's always this way, right? With a book or a movie or TV show, it's the timing of when it comes out. If this movie had come out in 1939, it wouldn't have had the same income. If it came out in 1967, it would have been about a different subject. It would have been like, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner or something like that, right? It would have been about what. So it was speaking to a zeitgeist in society, and particularly not just to the Jewish people, because again, there weren't that many Jewish people, but to the culture in general about the issues of tolerance, the issues of change, to make people think about how, and Italian people or Irish people, thinking about the issues they faced in their lives, and maybe people who were bigots and were racist to think about their lives. So we don't have any, but the fact that this was a huge commercial success, not just critical success you can understand, great writing, great acting, great directing, all that, but it was a huge commercial success means that it was really speaking to the people, and it was the word of mouth getting out. You have to see this film. You won't believe what happened, and all that kind of stuff. So very, very exciting times, I assume. Yes, other questions, please?
I'm just going to say it's more powerful as a metaphor than the details that you said are wonderful for the times.
Yeah.
But as a metaphor for today, it's even more powerful.
Well, that's what I was worried this would feel very dated to everybody. And again, again, people don't see this movie. It's hard to imagine why, right? There's so many, movies from the 40s. People still watch film noir. They watch screwball comedies. But for some reason, this movie has kind of disappeared. And you don't hear about it. It's not taught in film schools. I don't know why, because I actually thought it was surprisingly still quite relevant and felt kind of modern, and very sophisticated, And, what is this, 40, 50 years later? I'm not good at math that way. Other thoughts? And also I'm just curious because, of course, unfortunately, anti-Semitism is not gone at all, as you know. And it's still a huge issue everywhere in America, I'm sure, at times here in Canada. I don't know what to say about it. But again, for people who, was there anybody who didn't like the movie or found it objectionable, or was there some, a lot of you hadn't seen it before. So I'd love to hear some more thoughts about whether you enjoyed it or not. Yes, please.
I've seen the movie on the small screen on TV. I thought it was fantastic.
Thank you.
However, maybe I don't know who you are, but we were there at the exact same time at Westdale. What year were you born?
I was president in 65, 66.
Oh, you're a baby. Yeah. No, I was, well, wait a minute. Anyway, sorry. I was Jewish, Reformed. I was not, I am. I was not from an Orthodox family.
Right.
However, before I went to Westdale, I went to Strathallan Hillfield, which was a bastion of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant society. And I was well liked at school. I had tons of friends.
Right.
I got invited to the birthday parties, but I never got invited to stay overnight. And the girls weren't allowed to stay at my house. My mother was not invited to the teas at their home.
Right.
And when General Field Marshal Montgomery came to my friend's birthday party, and we were all asked to come up and meet him in courtesy, the mother told me that it was not necessary for me to go up if I didn't, it was all right. I didn't have to.
And this is in the mid 60s, right?
No, I was born in 46, so I might have been, 12. I guess.
No, but I meant even in high school. Yeah.
Oh yeah, but this was in grade school because this was a
grade school. I
elitist
understand.
private school. And I remember my parents being turned away from Delawana Inn when they had a reservation.
Really? Yeah.
Yes, but it was made under my uncle's name, who did not sound Semitic. So when my father, Harold Levy, arrived, they said, "Oh no, we don't have a reservation." He said, "Well, it's Mr. Freshman. No, you can't come in." And my dad jumped over the counter of the hotel and said, "I'm going to break your arm, but first I want you to make the call to, the police and tell them I can't stay here." And he did break his arm, unfortunately. But, I grew up with that stuff. I went to Strathallan, but I certainly could not go to the skating lessons at the Thistle Club.
Right.
When my mom called, they didn't have a class available. They said I could come until she mentioned her last name. So yes, I have seen all this, but I feel confident to say I have seen almost nothing of this with my children and their lives and their friends. I think hopefully we've established a melting pot. When I went to Westdale High School with him, there were 2 Asian guys, 1 girl, and 2 black girls. Everybody else was primarily Anglo with a few Jews tossed in.
Right.
But
and a couple of times snuck in too.
Yeah, but I don't know if everyone else feels this way, but I feel that we are more like a melting pot now.
Well, listen, I think, fortunately, I do think you're correct. I think things have changed. The laws have certainly changed, right? The quotas, the unemployment has changed, the issues around attending medical schools, law schools, academia, those have all changed. And for the Jewish people, for the most part, in North America, things have improved tremendously. But racism and prejudice like this has not changed. And the people who are suffering now, of course, are the Muslims and Asians and blacks, of course. In America, the racism is as prevalent as ever, as Donald Trump proved to all of us because he said it was okay to be a racist. But so I agree with you. There's been an evolution of sorts, and that's what happens over time. Remember, when the Irish first came to Hamilton, they were persecuted. By the time the Italians arrived, the Irish had become, middle-class citizens. And now it's time to prosecute the Italians, right? And they were the ones who suffered. So there is a process that continues on and on in our society. Tragically, I do hope and that, of course, things continue to improve and we start to recognize, the basic oneness of humanity, that we all are, but it continues. And you could also say the same thing about the treatment of women, but that's a different movie. So we'll get into that some other time. Anyhow, other comments or thoughts? You have another comment you'd like to make?
I was in kindergarten, I believe, when some white boys were playing with toy dump trucks, and I asked, "Can I play?"
Right.
And they said, "No, because you're brown."
Right.
So that's just a clear example. But this past summer, I worked at Westdale Children's School.
Oh, okay.
And this white kid, about 9 years old, approached me with a question. He was very shy about it at first, nervous. And he was like, "Why are people racist? And have you experienced racism?"
Yeah.
So that little juxtaposition was fascinating.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful news. Yeah. Well, I do think, where people are more educated and we have all learned, something, maybe. Yes, another comment from the back there. Yep.
Yeah, I'm sure many people realize that anti-Semitism has morphed, and that's why Erwin Kotler has become the permanent envoy against, for Holocaust remembrance and anti-Semitism. But the state of Israel has become the new Jew.
I'm sorry.
The state of Israel has become the new Jew.
Right.
And Israeli academics are being shunned in England and other places as an example. Just individuals, right?
Right.
Oh, because they come from Israel, they can't come to a conference or whatnot.
Right.
And we saw that with the Labour Party in England. And I think the three Ds, which you must have heard of, that Natan Sharansky, the Soviet refuseniks who went to Israel and became important there, delegitimization, double standards, and demonization. If you look at those very carefully into the International Holocaust Remembrance definition of anti-Semitism, which Kotler is bringing forward and was very involved in, the former Justice Minister of Canada, Erwin Kotler, I don't know if you realize.
No, I don't know this.
Well, he was in the cabinet, and he's, anyway, that's what to look out for.
No, and let's face it, right now in the world, there is a huge, a wave of this kind of right-wing, authoritative governments popping up all over Europe. And we all know what happened in the United States, right? And many countries, Germany, France, for example, anti-Semitism is become a bigger problem now than it had been for years, because that type of leadership, as we know, is trying to actually create societies where there is this kind of, dogmatic approach to how people should be and how people should live. And it's not meant to be tolerant, and it's not meant to be accepting. And I think it would be, naive for us to think, though I do agree with your comment that things are much better now in Canada than they were a long time, certainly 20, 30, 40 years ago. But to think that, this kind of prejudice and racism, and I'm not just talking about Jews, it is still prevalent. And that's why I think it is important that movies like this continue to get made, conversations like this continue to be had. My sister, who's a rabbi in Philadelphia, she spends all her time working with Muslims and working with imams, trying to help both Jews and other, non-Muslim people to understand, what does it mean to be a Muslim? What is the Islamic religion? There clearly is a color issue. There's a immigration issue with Muslims. I'm not aware of what the Muslim experience in Hamilton is like. I don't know if anybody knows anything about that, but this does continue. And I think, again, that's the beauty of this film, is that it does sort of, as much as it's about anti-Semitism, it's really about this whole issue of prejudice. And I think that maybe is why it seemed to be still relevant today, because it's talking about things that are kind of universal in terms of how people behave. Yeah. So other thoughts? Anybody have anything else they'd like to comment or share? Yep, up front here.
Just a quick observation on the movie itself, and as far as the actors within the movie. I would think most of them are probably not Jewish actors, or maybe one or two were. And I'm wondering, at that time, would a Jewish actor not want to be in a role or in a film like this? Well,
that's a great question. So the question, of course, is why weren't there Jewish actors to play this part? Why did they have to go get Gregory Peck? They theoretically... There weren't Jewish actors who were leading men. Now, that's not completely true. There was Paul Muni, the great Jewish actor who was a major star in the 30s and 40s. He was probably a little old for it. John Garfield, took a minor role, right? He was certainly a well-known Jewish actor. And then, of course, Warner Brothers had made The Jazz Singer, right, with Al Jolson, who was clearly, Jewish. And that movie, which was done, I think, in the late 20s, right, was about, a kid whose father was a cantor, right, and he was a cantor, a completely Jewish subject. The first talking film, huge. So there were anomalies. There were few moments where there was a Jewish actor, but Edward G. Robinson was Jewish, of course. But for the most part, as I said, they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want people to be aware of the fact that these movies were all being made by Jews. They completely controlled Hollywood and the film industry. And they were nervous that if people started to see these Jewish stories being told, that, there would be a groundswell to stop, and people would boycott the movies, or they wouldn't go to them. And the other problem, unfortunately, is that in the 30s, Germany was one of the largest markets for these movies. So, of course, they didn't want to make films that German audiences wouldn't go see, or Hitler would ban and not let them be seen. So it's, but yeah, I don't know if there was controversy at the time. I doubt there was, because I don't think there was another actor in the movie who was Jewish except for John Garfield. Yeah, and certainly the writer was. Moss Hart, of course, was Jewish. Yeah. Okay, so yes, one more question. Yep.
I thought Gregory Peck was actually well cast.
Gregory Peck was incredibly well cast. And in fact, he kept playing this role the rest of his life.
In a way, they chose a person who, when she said, of course, prejudice can be against beautiful people, against ugly people, whatever. I mean, he was charming. It was easy to see how everyone would like him. He's so good looking and charming. Right. And then, of course, turned their backs on him when they found out that he was Jewish. Like, I thought when he kind of, all the women were saying, "Oh man, get me one of those."
Yes, exactly.
He was well cast.
It was very well cast. Hard to imagine Cary Grant in the role, actually, when you think about it. And then, of course, Gregory Peck went on to make many other great movies. In fact, the very first movie we showed as part of this series was To Kill a Mockingbird. And if you think about Atticus Finch and the character he played, there were certainly some similarities to this guy. And one of the things that really struck me was, of course, he was also a single father, as Atticus Finch was, right, with Scout, and there was no mom, and of course in To Kill a Mockingbird, they didn't have time to throw in a romance, but I think they used the romance here very well to explore really the complexity of the issues. Because here was this lovely woman, Kathy, and everything was right, and she didn't get it. She didn't get how her unwillingness to speak up or was really anti-Semitic, and that was a tremendous, and he couldn't tell her that, she had to hear it from sort of someone else to really get it. But when she did, I just thought that was Incredible scene. That's a memorable scene, obviously.
Especially the gentleman's agreement.
Exactly. Now, you know, gentleman's agreement, of course, doesn't just refer to anti-Semitism. Gentleman's agreement is a term that had been developed many, many years before. And what it always means, of course, is that there's an unwritten agreement that people are willing to acknowledge. And it could be between two countries who don't want to, you know, actually have a trade agreement signed. It could be, you know, like a country club who is being restricted. So, you know, so the term gentleman's agreement was sort of a known term and kind of was a perfect title, of course. And it was the title of the book as well, you know, before this movie ever came out. But again, although the book was popular and everything else, it didn't, that's why movies are so great, right? Because they really penetrate and they evolve you perhaps emotionally in a way that books, it's very hard for a book to achieve that same kind of experience. The other thing they did, which was so brilliant, is they used a lot of humor, right, in the film. And that was probably Moss Hart, because he recognized this subject matter could be, you know, really heavy and turn off a lot of people. And by keeping it somewhat light and entertaining, some of the pacing you may have noticed, a lot of quick scenes, fade outs, you know, that it really was such brilliant craftsmanship. And it kind of makes me cringe when I look at modern day movies because you just don't see this quality anymore. And everything feels so loud and rushed and just kind of over the top. And this had this kind of nice, controlled quality that you kind of felt like there was a, you know, there was a clear guiding hand between every scene and every performance, even, you know, the kid, the secretary, you know, was fantastic, wasn't she? And yeah, it was a brilliantly conceived minor part, right? But to have that part so well written and performed, June Havoc, it was just, you know, anyhow, I you know, as you can tell, I hadn't seen this movie in, you know, probably 15, 20 years, and I was a little nervous because I was worried to feel very dated, and I'm so happy you all enjoyed it. So anyhow, look forward to seeing you all again. We also have a series on Sunday nights of international films hosted by Jeffrey Bender. He's been showing some great movies. So if I'm not here doing classics, Jeffrey will be here on Sundays doing his international films. Go to the website, you know, westdale.ca. Remember, we're a charity. We would love donations. Become a member, and then you get discounts, and, you know, and you hear about things before, you know, everybody else does. So anyhow, thank you all very much for coming. This was great.